Why nobody lives in northern Maine. The entire East Coast lights up at night like one unbroken wire from Washington to Boston. Then it hits Maine and goes dark. Half the state, an area bigger than Massachusetts and Connecticut combined, is essentially empty. Not wilderness, not protected land, just owned. And the owners never wanted neighbors. Pull up a map of New England and you'll notice something that doesn't add up. 5 of the 6 states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, fit together like puzzle pieces in the bottom half of the region. Then there's Maine, sprawling north and east, nearly as large as those 5 states combined. And almost nobody lives in most of it. People hear Maine and picture lobster shacks, lighthouses, maybe Portland's restaurant scene or Acadia's coastline. That's the southern sliver. Head north of Bangor and the state turns into something else entirely, a stretch of forest so vast and so empty that it has more in common with northern Canada than with the rest of New England. Aroostook County alone covers more ground than Connecticut and Rhode Island put together. Its population sits around 67,000 people, and it's been falling for decades. That's fewer residents than a mid-sized suburb, scattered across an area you could drive for hours without hitting a traffic light. In some of the townships farther west, census counts come back in single digits. A few come back at 0. Those empty townships don't have mayors. They don't have town councils or local police departments or zoning boards. Maine has a classification most Americans have never heard of, the unorganized territories. Land so sparsely populated that no local government was ever formed. The state legislature itself acts as the municipal authority. There's no town hall because there's no town. These territories cover roughly half of Maine's total land area, an almost incomprehensible amount of ungoverned space sitting on the eastern seaboard, the most densely developed corridor in the country. You can draw a line from Boston to Washington, roughly 450 miles of nearly continuous development, well over 50 million people, and at the top of that same corridor, there's a chunk of land the size of a small country where the state couldn't find enough residents to justify local government. The knee-jerk explanation is weather. And yes, northern Maine gets punishing winters. But cold alone doesn't empty a map. Quebec City sits at roughly the same latitude, endures the same winters, and has over 500,000 people. Duluth, Minnesota, is brutally cold and still holds a functioning metro area. Anchorage is darker, colder, more isolated, and it grew through the entire 20th century. Winter is a cost of doing business. It is not a wall. So what is the wall? Look at that satellite image again, and the answer starts to take shape, not in what's missing, but in what's there. The dark zone in northern Maine isn't empty federal land. It's not a national park or a military reservation. Almost all of it has been claimed, bought, and deeded for well over a century. The darkness on the satellite isn't the absence of ownership. It's the presence of a very specific kind of owner. The usual story of settlement in this country runs in a straight line. Land starts wild. Somebody homesteads it. A crossroads becomes a village. The village becomes a town. And if the geography cooperates, with a river, a harbor, or a rail junction, the town becomes a city. Northern Maine broke that pattern before it could even start. Industry arrived before settlers did. Not the kind that needs workers living nearby and spending paychecks at local stores. The kind that needs trees. Millions of trees standing on millions of acres with nobody around to get in the way. The timber companies didn't build towns. They built logging camps, seasonal, temporary, disposable. They didn't want roads connecting communities. They wanted roads that moved logs to rivers and rivers that moved logs to mills. The entire infrastructure was engineered for extraction, not habitation. And when you design a landscape to move wood instead of people, you get exactly the map you see today. By the time the average American family was heading west on the Oregon Trail or filing homestead claims in Kansas, the forests of northern Maine were already spoken for, purchased in enormous tracts by timber and paper interests that would hold them for generations. The land wasn't available. It was working as a tree farm the size of a state, operated by companies whose business model required that nobody else show up. The emptiness doesn't look like neglect. It looks like design. The population maps, the unorganized territories, the zero-resident townships, they aren't signs of a place that was forgotten. They're signs of a place that was captured early and held. And the companies were just the beginning, because even in places where timber outfits controlled the land, other American regions still managed to fill up. The Pacific Northwest was logged just as aggressively, and cities grew anyway. Something else kept Northern Maine from following that same script, and it had everything to do with what was never built to reach it. At their peak, a handful of paper and pulp corporations, names like Great Northern Paper, International Paper, and Boise Cascade, controlled combined land holdings that dwarfed most national parks. A single company could own a contiguous stretch of forest roughly the size of Yellowstone, not lease it from the government. Own it. Fee simple. Private property. Keep out, if we say so, ownership of land that, on a map, looks like it should belong to everyone. That ownership removed the land from the settlement equation entirely. In the American West, the federal government held vast territories and actively encouraged homesteading, gave the land away, sold it cheap, built railroads to reach it. In Northern Maine, the land was in private hands before any of that machinery could kick in. No Homestead Act carving quarter sections for farming families. No railroad land grants creating town sites every 10 miles along the tracks. No government incentive to populate, because the government didn't own what needed populating. What the companies built instead was a parallel world, hundreds of miles of gravel logging roads threading through the forest in every direction. But these roads connected cutting sites to rivers and mills, not communities. Today, the private road network in the North Maine woods stretches for thousands of miles, by some accounts more extensive than the public road system in the region. And gated is the key word. If you want to drive into the North Maine woods today, you pull up to a checkpoint, a physical gate staffed by an attendant, and you pay an access fee. The system is managed by North Maine Woods, Incorporated, a consortium of landowners who jointly administer access to roughly 3.5 million acres of private timberland. That's roughly the size of Connecticut, and you need permission to enter it. In most of America, you can drive to an empty stretch of land, look around, and at least imagine building something there. In Northern Maine, you can't even reach the empty stretch without passing through a gate controlled by the people who own it. The land isn't closed because it's protected wilderness. It's closed because it's private property being managed as a crop. The crop just happens to be trees, and trees don't need neighbors. Here's where the story takes a turn most people don't see coming. That forest, the vast, unbroken carpet of green you see on satellite images, looks like wilderness. It isn't. Almost all of it is second growth or third growth timber. It has been clear-cut and regrown in cycles for over a century. What looks like nature from 30,000 feet is an industrial product, a managed monoculture optimized for fiber yield. The wilderness of Northern Maine is a factory with a very convincing disguise. There is genuine ecological value up there. Moose, lynx, brook trout populations you won't find anywhere else on the East Coast. But the idea that you're looking at pristine, old-growth forest is, in most places, simply wrong. You're looking at a tree farm that was left alone just long enough between harvests to start looking ancient again. And then came the second lock. Starting in the 1990s, the economics of papermaking shifted. Mills closed. Global competition undercut domestic pulp prices. The big timber companies started selling off their main holdings, not in small parcels to aspiring homesteaders, but in enormous blocks. Some went to timber investment management organizations that kept logging, but had even less connection to the local economy than the old paper companies did. No mill town to support, no year-round workforce to house. Just trees as a financial asset on a spreadsheet in Boston or New York. But the other buyers were conservation groups. The Nature Conservancy, the Forest Society of Maine, the Appalachian Mountain Club, and others moved aggressively to purchase or place easements on millions of acres of former timber company land. The mechanism was the conservation easement, a legal restriction attached to the deed permanently that prohibits future development. The land can be logged sustainably, hunted, paddled, hiked. But it can never be settled. For a century, the land was kept empty because private companies needed trees, not towns. Then, in the span of about 15 years, much of that same land was locked into permanent emptiness by legal agreement, this time in the name of ecology rather than industry. The first lock was corporate. The second was conservation. The result on the satellite image is identical: darkness. And here's the uncomfortable overlap nobody talks about much. The conservation groups and the timber investors are, in practical terms, doing the same thing. Both are managing Northern Maine as a landscape where human settlement is, at best, irrelevant, and, at worst, a threat to the plan. The vocabulary changed. The map didn't. But ownership alone doesn't explain everything. What makes Northern Maine different is that the one thing that could have broken through, infrastructure, a railroad that stuck, a highway that actually reached the border, never showed up. Or worse, it showed up, did its job for a few decades, and then vanished. Interstate 95 runs up the coast, cuts inland past Bangor, and technically continues to Holton near the New Brunswick border. That's it. That single thread is the only interstate that touches Northern Maine, and it hugs the eastern edge. The vast interior has no interstate access at all. If you're standing in the center of Northern Maine and you want to reach an interstate, you're looking at a drive of 60, 80, sometimes over 100 miles on two-lane state roads through unbroken forest, in a region east of the Mississippi, on the same seaboard as New York City. The drive from Fort Kent, the town at Maine's northern tip, to Portland is roughly 370 miles. About 6 hours under good conditions, longer in winter, which is most of the year. Portland to New York City is roughly the same distance. A resident of Fort Kent is as far from their own state's economic center as Portland is from Manhattan, except the Portland to New York drive is on interstate the entire way. The Fort Kent to Portland drive spends hours on roads where the nearest gas station is a planning decision, not a guarantee. Northern Maine once had a railroad, the Bangor and Aroostook, built in the 1890s primarily to move timber and potatoes. Aroostook County was, for a stretch of the 20th century, one of the most productive potato farming regions in the country. The railroad connected towns like Caribou, Presque Isle, and Fort Fairfield to the rest of the state and, through interchange, to the rest of the country. Those towns existed, in large part, because the railroad made them viable. Then the math changed. Potato farming consolidated and shifted. Idaho and Washington scaled up production on cheaper, flatter, more irrigated land. The timber industry contracted as mills closed. The railroad lost its freight base. The Bangor and Aroostook went through bankruptcy, reorganization, and eventual absorption. Lines were abandoned. Some of the old rail beds are still visible from the air, long, straight clearings through the forest, slowly being swallowed by alders and birch, going nowhere. In the classic American pattern, when a railroad dies, a highway replaces it. That didn't happen here. The traffic volumes couldn't justify the construction costs. The tax base couldn't support maintenance, and the political will was 5 hours south in Augusta. One institution bucked the trend for a while. Loring Air Force Base, outside Limestone, was established in the late 1940s as a strategic air command installation. Limestone is about as close as you can get to the Soviet Union on a polar flight path while still standing on American soil. The base was enormous, with long runways built for B-52s, weapons storage, thousands of military personnel and their families. For 4 decades, Loring was the economic engine of the entire Upper County, a pocket economy in a place that had almost no other reason to generate one. Then the Cold War ended. The 1991 Base Realignment and Closure Commission recommended Loring for shutdown, and in September 1994, the base officially closed. Thousands of personnel transferred out. Families left. The businesses that served them closed. What the base had provided wasn't just jobs. It was a reason for people to be there that had nothing to do with local geography. When that reason was withdrawn, the geography reasserted itself immediately. For decades since, there's been one proposal that keeps surfacing and keeps dying: the East-West Highway. Build a modern highway corridor across northern Maine, connecting the Atlantic coast to Quebec. On paper, it makes sense. In practice, it runs into a wall of opposition from conservation groups that spent years protecting the North Maine woods, timber managers who don't want public roads fragmenting their holdings, and the staggering cost of building through that terrain with no existing tax base. The highway keeps getting studied, debated, and shelved. Meanwhile, the Canadian border sits right there, but might as well be another wall. The crossings in northern Maine handle little more than a trickle of traffic. Northern New Brunswick is sparsely populated, economically struggling, and just as poorly connected. The border doesn't join two populations. It separates two voids: timber gone, potatoes declining, railroad dead, airbase closed, highway never built, border leading nowhere. That should be the end of the story. But something unexpected is happening in Aroostook County right now. The obvious prediction for northern Maine is a straight line pointing down. Population falling, median age rising, schools closing, tax base eroding. And for a lot of the region, that prediction is accurate. The young leave for Portland, for Boston, for anywhere with a job listing and a cell signal. The ones who stay are older, and every year the gap between the people maintaining the roads and the people who'll need to maintain them next gets wider. But in certain pockets of Aroostook County, not everywhere, not dramatically, but measurably, something is moving in the other direction. Start with the economics. Land in northern Maine is absurdly cheap by any East Coast standard. You can buy farmland in Aroostook County for what can amount to a few $100s an acre. Actual tillable soil, flat and fertile, the same ground that once made this one of the country's top potato-producing regions. 100 acres up here might cost less than a one-bedroom condo in Portland. The problem has always been the follow-up question. Cheap land is worthless if there's no way to make a living on it. And for most of the last 50 years, there wasn't. Two things changed that equation. The first is broadband. Federal rural connectivity programs have been pushing internet access into parts of northern Maine that had nothing but satellite and dial-up for decades. It's not finished. It's not universal. But for a remote worker whose job lives on a laptop, it's enough. The threshold between impossible to work here and possible to work here isn't gigabit fiber. It's a stable connection that holds a video call. The second change is stranger. Over the past several years, Amish families have been quietly buying farmland in Aroostook County. Not a handful of families, enough to form recognizable communities and build schoolhouses. They're drawn by exactly the things that repel everyone else: isolation, cheap acreage, and a community infrastructure that doesn't depend on broadband, highways, or proximity to a city. It's a genuinely fascinating inversion. The entire story of northern Maine's emptiness is a story about missing connections. No railroad, no highway, no internet, no nearby metro area. The Amish settlement model doesn't need any of those connections. In a region defined by what was never built, they're building something that was never designed to rely on it. That doesn't mean Aroostook County is on the verge of a population boom. The numbers are small. The structural barriers, distance from a hospital, hours from an interstate, winters that test anyone's commitment, haven't moved. What's shifted is the value equation. For a narrow but real slice of people, northern Maine's emptiness went from being a deficit to being the entire point. But here's the twist that keeps this from being a simple comeback story. Some of the former timber company land, now held by investment groups and conservation organizations, is being enrolled in carbon credit programs. Leave the trees standing, measure the carbon they absorb, sell credits to corporations that need to offset their emissions. It is, in the most literal sense, getting paid to keep the land empty. For 150 years, northern Maine's land was managed on the principle that trees were worth more than towns. The timber companies made money growing and cutting trees. The conservation groups protected land by prohibiting development. And now the carbon market is offering a third version of the same idea. The forest is more valuable as a standing asset than anything a human community could replace it with. The vocabulary is different. The economic mechanism is new. The result on the map is identical. Meanwhile, the demographic clock keeps ticking. The median age in Aroostook County is among the highest in the country, and it's climbing. The region doesn't just need new residents. It needs them before the generation that currently runs the volunteer fire departments, maintains the town roads, and drives the school buses ages out of those roles. Go back to that satellite image one more time. The dark patch above Bangor, the void in the bright corridor of the eastern seaboard. You started this thinking it was wilderness, cold, remote, left behind by accident. It isn't. Every piece of that darkness has a deed attached to it and a decision behind it. The timber companies drew the first map. The military punched one hole in it and then walked away. The conservationists redrew the lines in green ink that says the same thing the old corporate deeds said, not for you. And now the carbon markets are writing a fourth version of the same sentence. Northern Maine isn't empty because nobody wanted it. It's empty because everyone who got hold of it wanted it exactly like this. Whether the next owners feel the same way, that's the question the map can't answer yet.